Good day. I make this this program, just after reports are pouring out of Kiev of a speech or statement by President Zelensky of Ukraine, accusing the powerful East Ukrainian oligarch Rinat Akhmetov of plotting a coup against him with the Russians. Now, to what extent these claims are true, or what the facts behind this somewhat bizarre story are, I'm unable at the moment to say, so I'm going to defer discussing this coup or attempted coup or alleged coup or imagined coup until after we have more details. What I'm going to do today is something rather different, which is I'm going to actually look at the military situation, the military balance in Ukraine and between the Ukrainian military and the militias in the Donbass, and also, of course, between Ukraine and Russia. And I'm going to just discuss briefly what the state of that balance is, and what might happen in the event that there was a war. Now, I always have to make an important qualification when I discuss military topics, which is that I am the ultimate civilian. I've never served in the military, in any military. I do happen to know, as a matter of fact, various people who have served in various militaries around the world, but I've never served in one myself. And I don't perhaps have the same attraction to military things that many people, other people do, people who feel that they can speak confidently about these matters, even if they've actually had no military or technological experience at all. And since we're talking about technology, perhaps it's worth saying that, of course, today war has become highly technological, and understanding war and how a war might play out, at least a great power war, obviously requires an understanding of weapons technology. And that's an understanding which, again, I do not really have. As I've discussed many times, I am not in any way a technologically minded person, and I'm absolutely not in a position to discuss the viability of particular weapon systems. Having said that, I think there's enough general information around, including discussions from the various defense ministries, to give us a reasonable picture, and one where even someone like myself can come to certain, I think, broadly safe conclusions. Now, what has precipitated this program is a lot of talk, especially in Russia, about arms supplies by the Western powers to Ukraine. And when we're talking about arms supplies, we're talking specifically about Javelin anti-tank missiles, of which allegedly Ukraine has now put to use on at least 2 occasions in the Donbass, and possibly Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, which apparently the United States may be intending to supply. At this point, I should say that, of course, these Javelin anti-tank missiles and these Stinger anti-aircraft missiles are being supplied by the United States. There's also all sorts of arms deals and agreements underway between Ukraine and Britain, which seem to be intended at upgrading the Ukrainian Navy. Though exactly what is envisaged, it's extremely difficult to say with any precision. Certainly, it doesn't seem as if we're looking at a major upgrade of the Ukrainian Navy to the point where it could become a real challenge to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And, of course, there's always the third issue, which is the NATO naval presence in the Black Sea, in which there now seem to be rotating warships, usually Arleigh Burke destroyers, operating now on a fairly regular basis in the Black Sea. By the way, I should stress that though the Russians are making a big play about the presence of these warships in the Black Sea, their presence there actually is not especially new. I can remember that during the Cold War, the United States regularly sent its warships into the Black Sea, and at that time the Russians responded to it calmly. But anyway, let's move on. And the initial focus, I think, must be the military balance between Ukraine and the militia forces in the Donbass. And here there's been much discussion about how Ukraine has supposedly upgraded its military as compared to its condition in 2014. In 2014, Ukraine did deploy a very large military in the eastern regions, again in an attempt to suppress the uprisings in the Donbass. Hundreds of tanks, hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles were deployed. The Ukrainians used artillery and multiple rocket launchers, and of course they also deployed their air force. And nonetheless, and notwithstanding, they were defeated. Now, here it's perhaps important to discuss, before we look at the Ukrainian military, the situation on the other side. Because after the events in Maidan and in Kiev in February 2014, where the change of government took place, an event which of course the Russians qualify as a coup, there was this general uprising in the Donbass, something which of course Western governments have always insisted was orchestrated by Russia. I am deeply skeptical, by the way, about that claim, and I can very well remember Western journalists, specifically British journalists, travelling around the Donbass at that time and commenting about the fact that the protests against the change of government in Kiev seemed to be spontaneous. There seemed to be a genuine groundswell of feeling in the Donbass, especially in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, against the change of government, the forcible change of government, which had taken place in Kiev. And to my mind, that's not at all surprising. It is consistently overlooked. It is something that Western governments and Western media never mention. That, of course, Ukraine, a bitterly divided country, at least a country deeply divided on linguistic lines, had the events that played out in Kiev were very much a protest move and then an overthrow of a Ukrainian faction based in the western regions of Ukraine, and which is predominantly Ukrainian speaking, against a Ukrainian president who drew his support from precisely those eastern regions where this protest movement and this uprising were taking place. Right up to the moment of his overthrow, Viktor Yanukovych, the then president of Ukraine, had solid support in the Donbass. He had the support in the elections of around 90% of the voters there. These were elections which were validated, by the way, by the European Union, and he was consistently, throughout the crisis in Ukraine, the Maidan crisis, he continued to be supported, strongly supported, by his electoral base, his own electoral base in the Donbass and in southeastern Ukraine. It's, to my mind, completely unsurprising that people in southeastern Ukraine, especially in the Donbass, should object strongly to the violent overthrow, the, as they would say, unconstitutional overthrow of a president whom they elected, and that they should seek to distance themselves from the government, the new government that had been installed in Kiev by a rival faction, as much as possible. I'm not here disputing that some people from Russia didn't come and play a role in these events, but I have no doubt at all that overwhelmingly the protest movement in the Donbass was a genuine popular wave, one which sought, as I said, some degree of distance from the new government in Kiev. Now, it's also at this point important to stress that in its early days, this protest movement was not seeking secession from Ukraine. What it was doing, or what it was demanding, was something called federalization. An idea, by the way, first floated, as I well remember, in 2014 by Germany, by the German government. The idea was that since Ukraine was such a divided country, and since it would be extremely difficult to create a political situation whereby a government in Kiev, based on support either from the western regions or from the eastern regions, would have full consent across Ukraine itself, that the Ukrainian constitution should be reorganized and reconstituted in order to enable people in all of these regions of Ukraine to administer to a great extent their own affairs, look after their own affairs, with the government in Kiev no longer in a position to dictate policy on all matters, including linguistic matters, on every region of Ukraine, but seeking instead to maintain, if you like, a kind of balance. And that was very much, as I very well remember, what the protesters in eastern Ukraine in early 2014 were discussing. And there were also, as I also very well remember, attempts by various parties, specifically the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and the German foreign minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, and, by the way, US Secretary of State Kerry at that time, John Kerry at that time. There were various attempts by all of these people to broker such negotiations. In fact, there was an important meeting, as I remember, I think it was in Geneva, between Lavrov and Kerry, in which they seemed to agree, they jointly agreed a statement of charting a way forward towards negotiations, towards federalization. And there were also detailed and prolonged discussions between Putin and Merkel at that time, and between Steinmeier and Lavrov, also seeking to chart a way towards negotiations. And it did look for a time as if there was a real prospect that those negotiations would succeed. What then happened, however, was that the new government in Kiev rejected outright such negotiations. It appeared for a while to play along with the idea of negotiations. It, in fact, used the time to deploy large forces to eastern Ukraine. And in June 2014, it launched an offensive, a military offensive. And as I said, that was an offensive which used tanks, artillery, infantry fighting vehicles, the Ukrainian Air Force, which treated, in other words, the protest movement in the Donbass as an existential danger to Ukraine itself. And at that time, the Ukrainians were talking about having launched an anti-terrorist operation. And these people in eastern Ukraine, the people whom they had supposedly agreed to negotiate with, they qualified them as terrorists. And I can also remember that the then president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, announced what was, in effect, what he claimed was a peace proposal, which was, in effect, a demand for the outright capitulation of the protesters in eastern Ukraine. Now, all of this leads me up to my next point about the situation in eastern Ukraine at that time. Undoubtedly, there were some people in eastern Ukraine who managed to get hold of weapons in some form, and there was no doubt at all that there were also various people coming from Russia who were participating in the protests in eastern Ukraine, some of whom indisputably were ex-military and some of whom undoubtedly came with weapons. And it is also a fact that some of these people who had military backgrounds or intelligence backgrounds managed to assume a very influential role in the protest movement in eastern Ukraine. And there's also no doubt at all that various Russian oligarchs or business people were partly funding the protests in eastern Ukraine. And I'm going to say straight away that I have no doubt that the Kremlin was aware of what was happening and was, shall we say, by no means averse to this happening too. They, of course, had an interest, a desire to see a Ukraine which federalized, which decentralized, and which did not align itself completely with the European Union and with NATO, and in other words, with the West. But saying that the Kremlin gave the green light to this kind of activity and might covertly, to some extent, have helped it along, does not mean that the Kremlin, the Russian government, was actually orchestrating all of the events in eastern Ukraine at that time. Anyway, there was this offensive against the protesters in eastern Ukraine. This was, as I said, in June 2014, and there was a great deal of fighting, and eventually the offensive failed and failed totally. In fact, there was a military disaster, the scale of which the Western media, by the way, has never fully acknowledged, and the Ukrainian military was comprehensively defeated. And this was despite the fact that, as I said, at the outset of the protests had been had intended initially to seek some sort of political settlement within Ukraine, and despite the fact that many of the protesters at the beginning were essentially unarmed. I can remember pictures, photographs that circulated at that time in which you saw some protesters with undoubtedly advanced rifles, automatic rifles, but others with old hunting rifles, and some of them were waving things like bats and things of that kind. But over the course of the fighting, which lasted from June until August, the situation steadily changed. And of course, this is a topic of enormous debate. And again, the operating assumption is the West, is that the reason it changed was because of direct military intervention by Russia. Supposedly, the Russian army entered eastern Ukraine, especially over the course of a battle at a place called Ilovaisk, and it was the Russian army which supposedly defeated the Ukrainian army in 2014. Now, I'm going to say straight away that a lot of the claims that are made at this point about this Ukrainian defeat in Ilovaisk by the Russian army are very detailed and very circumstantial, but I have long since come to realize that the fact that claims about certain events are detailed and circumstantial does not necessarily prove them to be true. I can remember at the time Western journalists, specifically British journalists, on the front line, traveling around Ukraine at that point, visiting eastern Ukraine, and reporting back that the vast majority of militia, the people the Ukrainian army was fighting, and the people who defeated Ukraine in August 2014, that they were in fact East Ukrainians. They were not Russians at all. And that, to my mind, seemed to call into question the whole theory that there was in fact an actual deployment of Russian military forces in eastern Ukraine, at least in the kind of organized way that has now been not just alleged in the West, but which has become, to my mind, the standard article of faith, if you like, in the West today. That is not to say, however, that the Russians were not involved in the events in eastern Ukraine at that time. I remember at the time, I was asked by various people what I thought would happen. I said that it would be politically impossible for the Russian government to allow people in eastern Ukraine who spoke Russian and who, as far as most Russians were concerned, were indistinguishable from Russians, and with whom many Russians and family and other contacts, that it was politically impossible for the Russian government simply to allow these people to be overrun. And in fact, what actually happened over the course of this fighting in June to August 2014 is that there is undoubtedly a flow of arms and supplies from Russia to the militias in eastern Ukraine, and there was also considerable help from the Russians in organising a new command system. I remember that all the sort of commanders who had initially started the insurgency were systematically replaced by people who were much more seen much more professional and much more attuned with thinking in Moscow. And I've no doubt that there was considerable intelligence information provided. And by the way, I also recall that the Russian artillery, the Russian army's artillery, located in Russia itself, nonetheless did carry out long-range artillery strikes on Ukrainian formations during this fighting. But as well as this flow of weapons, which included, of course, automatic rifles and sniper rifles and night vision goggles and anti-aircraft systems, handheld anti-aircraft missile systems, by the way. Perhaps the single most important thing that the Russians did, and again, I remember it, and it's not very widely reported, was that a retired officer of the Russian General Staff was sent to eastern Ukraine. He seems to have established his headquarters in the East Ukrainian town of Krasnodon on the Ukrainian-Russian border, and he effectively took charge of the fighting. And this person approached the fighting in the kind of classic way that you would expect from a Russian General Staff officer. He allowed the Ukrainians to launch offensives with their armoured forces. He then had those offensives, the supply lines for these strike forces, he had them cut off with his light infantry. He would encircle the Ukrainian troops in what the Russians called cauldrons, and eventually the Ukrainian troops would surrender, and their heavy equipment would then pass to re-equip the militia. This is very classic style of Russian warfare. It was those who are students of the Second World War on the Eastern Front will recognize a great deal of this. And these tanks and armored vehicles that would then be captured from the Ukrainians would then be reused and refurbished, and the militia was then gradually setting up armored units based upon them. And eventually, in the summer of 2014, in August, this person felt that the situation had reached that point where it was possible for the East Ukrainian forces to actually go over to the offensive, and they did carry out that offensive, and Ukraine suffered an overwhelming defeat. Now, again, the scale of that defeat has been underestimated by some people, but I remember that Ukrainian President Poroshenko in September 2014 provided a report in which, for example, he said that up to 60% of Ukraine's total stock of armoured vehicles had been lost in the fighting. This speech of Poroshenko's from that time is one that people don't remember very well and prefer not to discuss, in my experience. Now, why was it the case then that the Western powers insisted that it was not the militia, admittedly assisted, commanded, supported by people and material from Russia? Why did they insist that it was the actual Russian army that went into eastern Ukraine and turned the tables so decisively on the Ukrainians? Well, there were two reasons, in my opinion. The first reason, which was the obvious one, is that it was politically much easier to do that than to admit, or rather than to deny, that the Russian government was not involved. It meant that people in the West were able to say that it was the Russians who had orchestrated these protests in eastern Ukraine, and it was the Russians who had defeated the Ukrainian army. It was a way for the West to conceal the fact that the coup or change of power in Kiev in February 2014 was far from universally supported. Indeed, it was vigorously opposed by many people in Ukraine. There was an unwillingness at that time to acknowledge the fact that many Ukrainians were profoundly opposed to Ukraine's pro-Western orientation, which is what, of course, the new Ukrainian government, installed in February 2014, was seeking. But there was another reason, and I think this is more to do with the Western media than it has to do with Western governments. I assume and presume that Western governments had fairly accurate information about the course of the fighting in eastern Ukraine, and would have known that after making what appeared to be rapid advances in the first week of June, the Ukrainian offensive had got bogged down and was in fact facing disaster. But that was not how the Western media was reporting the story. The Ukrainians, of course, throughout this period from June until August, were claiming victory after victory. And I, who have a skeptical disposition, started to notice that many of the victories they were claiming were in the same places as victories they had claimed previously. So it became increasingly obvious that Ukrainian claims of massive advances and of conclusive victories were simply not true. It also became apparent to me from reading reports from the other side, something which of course Western media did not do, reports that came out of eastern Ukraine and from sympathetic Russian sources, Russian bloggers, that in fact the fighting in eastern Ukraine was far from going Ukraine's way, that all these encirclements that I talked about, the Russians call them cauldrons, were taking place, and that in fact, again, from mid-June, the situation of the Ukrainian military was becoming increasingly critical. And to give one example, a certain airliner was shot down over the course of this fighting. I'm not going to make my life difficult by identifying it. I have to always consider the concerns that this platform provider has about these things. That particular airliner was shot down in circumstances, rather confused circumstances. What many people don't know, in fact, what the vast majority do not know, is that the context in which that airliner was shot down was an encirclement of Ukrainian troops in an area of the Donbass which came to be called at that time by the Russians and by the East Ukrainian militia the Southern Cauldron. That was, by the way, in some respects, the decisive battle in the Donbass war of 2014, rather than the Battle of Ilovaisk, about which we hear so much. You will find that there is very little information about the Battle of the Southern Cauldron available publicly, but I remember that at the time, if you followed Russian and East Ukrainian sources, it was a very big deal indeed. Anyway, to proceed, the fact that the Western media were reporting one Ukrainian victory after another, and were producing maps of the conflict zone based on information that the Ukrainians were providing, maps which it was very obvious to me after a certain point were wholly inaccurate. When the Ukrainian military collapsed, it became necessary to explain to the Western public why all the claims about Ukrainian victories were wrong and why the Western media had got its reporting so completely wrong. And the easy way to do it was to blame the Russians, to say that it was the Russians who'd launched this great offensive at the Battle of Ilovaisk and had defeated the Ukrainian army then. Now, all of this now leads me up to the situation today, because as you will have appreciated, at the outset of the Donbass war in June 2014, the situation was that Ukraine had a military, perhaps not a very good military, perhaps not a very well organized military, perhaps its tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and aircraft and artillery and multiple rocket launchers were not in the best condition. Perhaps many of the troops were not especially trained, but it was nonetheless an organized military. It was relative to the militia in the Donbass, which may at that point have numbered perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 men in total. It appeared to be a very much more powerful force indeed. And on any calculus, it started that war in June 2014 from a position of overwhelming advantage. And yet, nonetheless, it lost. Now, let's move forward to the situation today. Now, one thing which has changed radically since June 2014 is that the militias in the Donbass have become immeasurably better equipped, far better trained, and undoubtedly this has been because of training provided by the Russian military. And in fact, the militia in the Donbass today has many of the features of a regular army. It's still heavily outnumbered by the Ukrainian army, but it is not the sort of ragged force that it was at the start of the Ukrainian offensive back in June 2014. So already we see that in terms of its adversary, Ukraine would be faced, even if the fighting were entirely confined to forces within eastern Ukraine, Ukraine would be faced with a much more formidable adversary than the one it faced back in June 2014. What about the Ukrainian army? Now, the Ukrainian army has received a lot of funding from the Ukrainian government. There's no doubt there's been a significant reorganization. There's no doubt, or at least I prepared to believe and accept, that Ukrainian commanders and troops are much better trained than they were in 2014. However, that doesn't, to my mind, alter the underlying change in the balance. We've seen an upgrade of the Ukrainian army from what it was back in June 2014, but we have seen a transformation in the militia in the Donbass as compared to what it was at the start of the fighting in June 2014. So let us say that the Ukrainian army has improved by, shall we say, 50%. It's 50% qualitatively better than it was in 2014. The Ukrainian militia has perhaps improved by, shall we say, something like a factor of 100% plus as compared with June 2014. On the face of it, the military balance, even in terms of the internal forces within Ukraine, has shifted against Ukraine since the fighting in 2014. Now, let's also consider a lot of this talk about Western equipment which has been supplied to Ukraine. And it's very interesting to see what sort of equipment the United States in particular has been supplying to the Ukrainian military. We're talking about things like Javelin, anti-tank missiles, very complicated, expensive, and difficult weapons to use, incidentally. And Russian reports suggest that the first attempt by the Ukrainian military to use them on the ceasefire line ended in failure. It supplied anti-tank missiles, and it's apparently talking about supplying anti-aircraft missiles. Now, any weapon system can be used both in an offensive and in a defensive role. But having said that, Javelin anti-tank missiles, complex and expensive as they are principally intended to be used against tanks. Now, you can use them offensively if you are advancing and you're facing a counteroffensive by tanks, or if those tanks are there blocking your presence. But more properly, they are there to protect infantry from tanks. They can, of course, be used for other things. They can be used for shelling and for blowing up bunkers and things like that. But it's important to say again that they are very expensive and complex weapons, and it would probably make little sense, actually, to use such complex and expensive weapons in such a role when Ukraine itself produces anti-tank missiles, much simpler and far cheaper anti-tank missiles that could be used as, say, bunker busters and that kind of thing, and which cost only a fraction of what the Javelins cost, and which are much easier to use. I would add that even if we allow for the fact that the United States has supplied, shall we say, several hundred sets of Javelin missiles to Ukraine, their number, Ukraine only has a limited quantity of these missiles, and one would assume, therefore, that the Ukrainians would primarily want to use them against tanks. Now, if we look at this logically, then anti-tank missiles are probably best used to defend or protect infantry against a tank attack, or at least an armoured attack. And though, as I said, like all weapon systems, they can be used in both an offensive and a defensive role. Logically, one would assume that a weapon system like the Javelin is most effectively and appropriately used in a defensive role to defend infantry against an armoured offensive. So, I'm obviously simplifying, but this doesn't look like weapons deliveries that are particularly well suited to Ukraine launching an offensive in eastern Ukraine. And the same, of course, applies to the Stinger anti-aircraft missile system if it is ever supplied. I understand that it hasn't yet been supplied at the moment. These are handheld, short-range anti-aircraft missiles. They're potent, they're much more advanced than the Stinger anti-aircraft missiles that were used by the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s, but they are short-ranged. They are not able to establish control of airspace over a battle zone in the way that much more powerful anti-aircraft missile systems, or of course fighter jets, would be able to do. Again, they look like weapons more appropriate to defend infantry from attack, air attack, than to provide infantry, than to enable infantry to start an offensive in eastern Ukraine. So these American weapon systems, provided, by the way, in not vast quantities, which have been going to eastern Ukraine, don't seem to be of the sort that one would think would be best calculated to facilitate a Ukrainian offensive. If the United States were to start supplying a different type of weapon system to Ukraine, let us say Abrams tanks, Apache helicopter gunships, F-16 fighter jets, M109 Paladin mobile tracked guns, well, then it would be an entirely different story. Then one would be looking at the development of an armoured force such as one would expect or assume Ukraine would be able to use in eastern Ukraine in order to achieve some kind of offensive there, which could, in theory, roll up the militia in eastern Ukraine and do so quickly. These weapons that the United States are supplying, undoubtedly they're potent weapons, but they seem to have a principally defensive role. Now, it also needs to be said that, of course, Ukraine in other respects hasn't entirely stood still. It's imported some infantry fighting vehicles from various Western countries, including Britain. Apparently, they have not been impressed by the quality of these vehicles that they have been supplied. Some of them apparently are not suited for Ukrainian conditions. But the vast bulk of Ukraine's armoured forces are the same Soviet-era armoured forces that Ukraine had when it launched its failed offensive in 2014. T-64 tanks left over from the Soviet Union, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, BTR armoured personnel, wheeled armoured personnel carriers, those sort of weapon systems, as I said, left over from the Soviet arsenals of the Cold War. Potent, powerful weapons, no doubt, but are outdated to a great extent. Ukraine has attempted at various times to relaunch tank production at a large tank factory which it inherited from the Soviet Union in the city of Kharkiv in northeast Ukraine. However, those attempts, so I understand, have not been particularly successful. The Ukrainians have produced or have designed a modernized tank based on the T-64, but apparently they have only so far been able to build two, and one of them apparently goes on tour around the world in order to try and interest buyers in acquiring it. In addition, Ukraine still tries to earn hard currency by supplying armoured vehicles, leftover armoured vehicles from its Soviet-era tank fleets and armoured vehicle fleets to various countries around the world. I understand, for example, that Ukraine has supplied tanks to countries in East Africa. I believe South Sudan is a case in point. So Ukraine has not modernized or developed its armored forces to any great extent since 2014, nor has it upgraded its air force in terms of aircraft. Again, probably Ukrainian pilots are better trained and better organized than they were in 2014. No doubt there have been considerable advances in command and control and that sort of thing, things that are invisible but whose importance is not to be discounted. But Ukraine lost a lot of aircraft over the course of the fighting in 2014. It seems that some of the more advanced fighter jets, like the Sukhoi 27 fighter jets, left over from the Soviet era, may not be fully serviceable. And in any event, the important thing is that they are fighter jets left over from the Soviet era. They were potent fighter jets in the 1980s, fully up to date as of the technology of that time. But in the years since then, things have changed. And of course, this is now where we come to what has happened on the other side. because, of course, in any discussion about the Ukrainian military, we need to look at the situation with the Russian military, because, of course, the Russians have spoken repeatedly and on numerous occasions about the fact that a Ukrainian offensive in eastern Ukraine would result in a Russian counteroffensive. Now, there is no doubt at all that back in 2014, the Russian military already operated at a much higher level of technological, at a much higher technological level and at a much higher level of combat efficiency than the Ukrainian military did. Russian aircraft at that time had been substantially upgraded over the type of aircraft that they had been in the era of the Soviet Union, and the same to some extent applied to the tank and armoured forces. Nonetheless, it is important to say that though the Russians had made very great progress in terms of command and control, communications, electronic warfare, and such like, in 2014, their military was at the very initial stages of a much broader modernization program. The vast bulk of Russian armored forces in 2014, their tanks, their infantry fighting vehicles, their APCs, their artillery, were of the same vintage, the late Soviet era, as those in the Ukrainian military at that time. Now, things have started to change. The major change, importantly, is not in the ground forces, but in aviation, where the Russian Air Force in 2014 still relied, like the Ukrainian Air Force at that time, still relied on Soviet-era fighter jets actually built during the era of the Soviet Union, to some extent, of course, upgraded. Today, the situation is very different. The Russians, since 2014, have re-equipped their fighter regiments with much more advanced fighter jets as compared to those they had in 2014. Fighter jets like the very potent Sukhoi 35 and Sukhoi 30 and the very powerful fighter bomber, the Sukhoi 34. Now, these already existed in 2014, but in very small numbers. You could literally count their numbers on your hands. Today, they exist in hundreds. The Russian Air Force has hundreds of them. And the pilots who operate these much more advanced fighter jets are, of course, pilots who have actually, unlike Ukrainian pilots, recent and sustained combat experience in places like Syria. So the Russian Air Force today comprehensively outmatches the Ukrainian Air Force to a far greater extent than was the case back in 2014. And of course, it also is the case with other weapon systems too. Increasingly, the Russians have been increasing their number of very advanced S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems. These are, by some estimates, the most advanced anti-aircraft missile systems in the world. They have deployed new anti-aircraft missile systems and anti-drone systems like the Pantsir, which is a short-range point defense system. Again, these systems existed in 2014, but not in anything like the level, the quantity that they do today. Today, there are far more of these systems than existed in 2014, and they are distributed across the Russian military to a vastly greater extent than was the case in 2014. And of course, though we know far less about this, it is overwhelmingly likely that the Russians have also to a very great extent, continued to upgrade and improve their enormously potent electronic warfare systems. The Western powers were astonished by the potency of these systems when the Russians put them to use against Ukraine in support of the militia during the 2014 fighting, and apparently the Russians have also used them sporadically in Syria since then. But we must assume that things have not stood still, and that these electronic warfare systems and other such systems that the Russians undoubtedly possess now operate at a much higher level of efficiency than they did in 2014. And there's no doubt also that the Russian military today is much better trained, much better led, much better commanded than it was in 2014. Russian officers have been, many Russian officers, commanders, have received on-the-spot combat experience in Syria and other places, and there's been a major reorganization of the Russian command structure as compared with what was the case in 2014. Now, that means that it seems to me that the military balance overall, both internally as between Ukraine and the militia forces in eastern Ukraine, that the Ukraine would potentially fight, and as between Ukraine and Russia, has tilted heavily since 2014 against Ukraine. There may be a lot of talk about how much better the Ukrainian military has become since 2014, but it seems to me likely, indeed overwhelmingly likely, that both the militia in the Donbass and the Russian military overall are far better than they were in 2014, and that the improvements that they've undergone completely eclipse what the Ukrainians have achieved since that time. Now, there is one area where, of course, things are rather more complicated, which is, I said that Ukraine, that these weapons supplies that the United States has provided to Ukraine, the Javelin anti-tank missiles, the Stinger anti-aircraft missiles that are under discussion, are essentially defensive weapons. But of course, Ukraine did buy recently from Turkey drones which could be used and are in fact probably plausibly intended to be used in a strike offensive role in order to launch an offensive in the Donbass. My impression is that the Russians are far more concerned about these drones that provided by Turkey than they are about the Javelins and the Stingers, precisely because these drones could be used offensively and might encourage the Ukrainians to act offensively. But here again, there is a difference, because though Ukraine has apparently acquired around 12 of these drones from Turkey, Russia has produced hundreds of drones since that time. Not all of these drones are, of course, strike drones, but already we see more numbers of strike drones starting to appear within the Russian Air Force. And Putin, in fact, recently commented that the Russian Air Force now has 2,000 drones, as compared with the situation in 2014, when it had very few and no strike drones to speak of. So even in this area where the Ukrainians have arguably acquired a potent weapon system, the other side, the Russians, have developed and are acquiring far more of them. So it doesn't look to me as if the situation for Ukraine in military terms is a particularly good one. Ukrainian military could probably put up something of a fight. It was something of a fight if Ukraine were invaded by Russia, something that the Russians have repeatedly ruled out. The Ukrainian military would probably be able to defeat the militia in the Donbass because it is so much bigger than the militia. There would probably be a long fight and a bitter one, and there would be large numbers of casualties. But if Russia became involved, either supporting the militia or launching a counteroffensive, it's difficult to imagine how Ukraine could win. Arguably, the debacle as compared to 2014 would be greater, even greater. Now, I'm going to say something else because it seems to me that the military balance has arguably shifted against Ukraine since June 2014. But all the indications are that over the next couple of years, it's going to shift further still. I said that the Russians have been re-equipping and reorganizing their army since 2014. But it's important to say that it is only now that that process of re-equipment is gaining accelerated momentum. Some of the new weapon systems that the Russians have been displaying and discussing and analyzing are only now starting to enter service in large numbers. So the Sukhoi 57, fifth generation stealth fighter, only this year entered service with the Russian Air Force, and the Russians only have about 2 or 3 actually operating in their Air Force at the moment. At the start of this year, apparently, they expect to have around 5 or 6 or perhaps a few more than that. And in terms of armoured vehicles, the much talked about Armator T-14 tank and its accompanying infantry fighting vehicles is only expected to start entering service in quantity from about 2013. Now, the Armator tank, the Sukhoi 57 fighter jet, the Okhotnik strike drone, the Orion drone, all those sort of new systems that the Russians are now producing and bringing into service, they are, of course, immeasurably more potent than any kind of weapon system that Ukraine has or is realistically ever likely to field. So not only has the military balance, or so it seems to me, shifted against Ukraine since 2014, over the next 5 years, it's likely to shift far more. One reason why I think it is most unlikely that the Russians have any plans to launch an offensive in eastern Ukraine or against Ukraine this winter, quite apart from the many political considerations, is that I think that the Russians, being still in the throes of a modernization process, are hardly likely to launch an offensive of that nature whilst that modernization process of their military is still underway. In fact, if you go over Russian history, you will find that both world wars, the World War in 1914, the First World War started in 1914, and the World War, the war involving the Soviet Union, which began in 1941, they too were launched by Germany in that case against first Imperial Russia and then the Soviet Union at a time when the Tsarist army and the Red Army were again in the early stages of the very sort of re-equipment and reorganization that the Russian army is undergoing now. And this is something which is burned into Russian military history. All Russian generals and officers get history courses, and they know about this. And I would have thought that they would be strongly advising the Kremlin that just as Russia experienced severe problems in 1914 and in 1941, because the re-equipment of the Russian army in those 2 years was still far from complete and very much in its early stages. They must be advising the Kremlin at the moment against starting any adventures in Ukraine before that process of re-equipment has either been completed or has at least gained much more momentum and tempo. So overall, it seems to me that we are looking at a situation where it makes little sense for the Russians to launch an offensive now. Anyway, that is my own reading of the situation. I very much doubt myself that the Russians are realistically looking to attack Ukraine at this time. There are ample political and military reasons which would advise them against doing so. But I also believe, and it is absolutely my view, that if there was a war, then Ukraine would lose and lose comprehensively, and that the military balance, contrary to what some people in Ukraine are claiming, has actually shifted against Ukraine, and that the Western powers have done actually very little to help Ukraine reverse that situation. And as for all those American ships in the Black Sea, all I will say is that the chances of them becoming directly involved in a shooting war with Russia over Ukraine are non-existent, and the Russians know it. Well, thank you for joining me again today for this program. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs, both on this channel and our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. And please also remember to check us out on our other platforms, BitChute Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, SuperU, but also principally Locals, where we have a thriving community, where we're publishing an increasing amount of exclusive content, where I now regularly do my own lives on Wednesday, and where you can participate actively and fully if that is what you wish. And you can also, if you want to support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop. And of course, on this Thanksgiving week, I have my magic mug with a flag of the United States. And please also check your subscription to this channel. Press the like button if you've liked this video. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day. Until then.